The Velcron Empire had ruled the galaxy for millions of years. Their ships traveled between stars like birds crossing a small pond. Their technology was so advanced that other species called them gods. Fleet Commander Zetharan stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the star charts with mild interest. The mission was simple and boring. His 12 ships were assigned to revisit an old world that Velcron scientists had surveyed 20,000 years ago. Back then, the planet was called Earth, and it was home to primitive creatures that barely knew how to make fire. The ancient records were clear. Humans were simple animals that lived in caves and hunted with stone tools. The Velcron science team had spent exactly 1 day studying them before deciding they were not worth any more attention. The report filed that day labeled humans as low priority with minimal threat assessment. Evolution on Earth was moving slowly. The scientists predicted it would take at least another 100,000 years before humans might discover basic agriculture. Perhaps in a million years they might build simple cities. Interstellar travel was considered impossible for such a limited species. Zetharan expected to find perhaps small villages on this return visit. Maybe humans had learned to farm. Maybe they built huts instead of living in caves. It would be mildly interesting to see how far they had progressed. He would update the records and move on to the next survey target. The whole visit should take less than a week. Then his fleet could return home, and he could retire with honors. This was supposed to be an easy final mission before his long service ended. The 12 Velcron ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system. Immediately, every alarm on every ship began screaming. Zetharan's 3 hearts started pounding in his chest. The sensor screens lit up with thousands of contacts. His tactical officer's voice shook as he read the data. The third planet was surrounded by artificial satellites. Thousands of them. Energy signatures blazed across the entire star system like a spider web made of light. Space stations orbited the planet in perfect geometric patterns. There were structures on the moon. There were colonies on the 4th planet. Asteroid mining operations dotted the belt between the planets. Zetharan felt his legs weaken. This was impossible. 20,000 years was nothing in evolutionary terms. It was a blink, a moment. Species did not advance from caves to space stations in 20,000 years. His own people had taken 12 million years to achieve interstellar flight. The fastest developing species on record had taken 300,000 years, but the sensors did not lie. The evidence was right there in front of him, blazing across every screen on his ship. His communications officer turned to him with wide, frightened eyes. They were being scanned. Multiple sources were targeting them. The resolution of the scans was incredibly detailed. Far more detailed than Velcron sensors could achieve. Before Zetharan could give any orders, a transmission cut through their communications like a knife through flesh. A face appeared on the main screen. It was a human face. A female with dark hair pulled back tightly. Her eyes were cold and hard like chips of ice. Her expression showed no fear, only authority and barely concealed irritation. The woman spoke in perfect Velcron language. Her pronunciation was flawless. She identified herself as Director Kate Morrison of Earth Defense Command. She informed them they had entered restricted space. She ordered them to power down all weapons and state their intentions immediately. Then she said something that made Zetharan's blood turn cold. She said if they did not comply within 60 seconds, they would be fired upon. She said this like she was discussing the weather. Casual, confident, certain. Zetharan looked at his tactical officer desperately. The young officer was staring at his screens with his mandibles clicking in distress. 20 warships were closing on their position. No, not warships. These vessels were something else. They moved with predatory grace. Their hulls were sleek and dark like deep ocean predators. Energy readings from those ships made no sense. The power signatures were impossible. Each one was generating more energy than a Velcron battle station. Weapons ports studded their surfaces like the scales on a serpent. The fleet commander's mind raced. His ships were exploration vessels. They carried light defensive weapons meant to discourage pirates and asteroid creatures. Nothing more. The human ships approaching them were clearly designed for war. He could see it in every line of their construction. These were not exploration ships. These were not science vessels. These were weapons built to kill. And there were 20 of them surrounding his 12 ships like sharks circling wounded prey. Zetharan made the only choice available to him. He ordered his weapons powered down. He opened a channel to the human female and stated that his intentions were peaceful. He explained that his people had visited Earth 20,000 years ago. He said they were simply returning to update their records. He tried to keep his voice calm, but he could hear it shaking. The human woman listened to his explanation without any change in her cold expression. When he finished speaking, she was silent for several long seconds that felt like hours. Director Morrison finally responded. She said his fleet would be escorted to Earth orbit. She said a delegation would be permitted to dock at Unity Station. She said any aggressive action would result in immediate destruction of his entire fleet. She said all of this in the same flat, calm tone. Then she cut the transmission without waiting for his response. The screen went dark. Zetharan stood there staring at the empty screen while his bridge crew looked at him with fear in their eyes. The human warships moved into formation around the Velcron fleet. They were not aggressive, but their message was clear. The Velcron ships were prisoners. They were being herded like domesticated animals. Zetharan had served in the Velcron military for 200 years. He had fought in border conflicts. He had commanded fleets in deep space. Never in his entire life had he felt so utterly helpless. These humans had appeared on his sensors and within minutes had completely dominated his entire fleet without firing a single shot. The casual efficiency of it was terrifying. As his ship began moving toward the inner system under escort, Zetharan pulled up the ancient records from the first visit. He looked at the images of primitive humans huddling in caves. He looked at the assessment that called them evolutionarily stagnant. He looked at the prediction that they would never achieve anything significant. Then he looked at the warship pacing his vessel like a hunting cat. Something had gone terribly wrong. Something had changed these simple cave dwellers into something that frightened him more than anything he had encountered in 2 centuries of military service. The journey to Earth orbit took 6 hours. During that entire time, Zetharan watched the human warships through his viewports with growing dread. They never wavered from their formation. Their movements were precise and coordinated like a school of fish moving as one organism. His sensors kept trying to analyze their technology, but the readings made no sense. The hulls seemed to shift and adapt. Energy patterns changed constantly. It was like trying to analyze something alive rather than a machine built from metal and circuits. Unity Station grew larger in the viewport as they approached. Zetharan had seen space stations before. Every spacefaring species built them. They were usually functional structures designed for efficiency rather than beauty. But Unity Station was different. It was massive beyond anything he had imagined. The station rotated slowly in space, creating artificial gravity through spin, 12 miles across, gardens visible through transparent sections, towers reaching toward the center, docking bays that could hold hundreds of ships. Lights blazed across its surface like a city floating in the void. Commander Jack Hayes stood on the bridge of the EDS frontier and watched the alien ships with cold satisfaction. He had read the historical files, the ones the Velcron themselves had transmitted as proof of their previous visit. The arrogance in those ancient reports had made his blood boil, the way they had dismissed humanity as irrelevant. The casual contempt in every line, the certainty that humans would never amount to anything. He had spent his entire career preparing for this moment. The moment when the Velcron would return and see what they had helped create. His communications officer, Lieutenant Amy Price, turned to him with a slight smile. The delegation was cleared to dock. Hayes gave the order and watched as the alien shuttle detached from their flagship. It looked crude compared to human shuttles, bulky and inefficient. He wondered what else about Velcron technology would prove to be outdated. The thought pleased him more than it probably should. 20,000 years of assuming they were superior. 20,000 years of being wrong. Now they would learn the truth. The Velcron delegation consisted of 12 individuals led by Fleet Commander Zetherin. They were tall and insectoid with multiple limbs and compound eyes. Their exoskeletons were covered in ceremonial markings. They walked with the careful dignity of people trying not to show fear. Hayes met them at the airlock with a security detail. The humans were deliberately dressed in simple uniforms. Nothing fancy, nothing that screamed military power. But every human carried themselves with absolute confidence. That was the real message. Humans were at home here. This was their space. The Velcron were guests, and not particularly welcome ones. As they walked through Unity Station, the aliens kept looking around with barely concealed shock. Human children ran past laughing and playing. They manipulated holographic toys with casual expertise that would require years of training in Velcron society. An elderly human walked by carrying a device that bent gravity to lift a massive piece of equipment. He whistled while he worked like this was the most normal thing in the world. A medical center advertised genetic optimization and cellular regeneration, services that could extend human life indefinitely. Technologies the Velcron considered theoretical at best. The delegation was brought to the council chamber. It was a large room with curved walls covered in displays showing Earth and all its colonies. Representatives from Mars sat beside delegates from the Jovian moons. Asteroid belt miners shared space with deep space explorers. All human, all confident. All looking at the Velcron visitors with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. At the center sat Chairwoman Linda Carter. She was a stern woman who appeared to be in her 50s, but Velcron medical scanners suggested she was actually over 200 years old. Humans had conquered aging. Another impossibility made real. Linda Carter did not stand when the Velcron entered. She did not smile. She simply looked at them with hard eyes and gestured to seats that had been prepared. The seats were too small and positioned lower than the human chairs. A deliberate insult. Zetherin noticed but said nothing. He was beginning to understand that humans did nothing by accident. Everything was calculated. Every gesture carried meaning. They had learned the games that elder species played and had become very good at playing them. The chairwoman spoke directly. Her voice was clear and carried easily through the chamber. She said that 20,000 years ago the Velcron had come to Earth. They had studied humans like insects in a laboratory. They had deemed humanity irrelevant and left without a second thought. She said all of this without raising her voice or showing any emotion, just stating facts. Then she leaned forward, and her eyes grew even harder. She said that the insects had built a civilization that now spanned multiple star systems. She said she imagined this was quite disturbing for species that assumed they would always be superior. Zetherin tried to maintain his composure. His diplomatic training kicked in automatically. He began to explain that the assessment had been based on standard evolutionary models, that no offense had been meant, that the Velcron people respected all forms of life regardless of their development level. Even as he spoke, he knew how hollow the words sounded. The ancient reports had not been respectful. They had been dismissive and contemptuous. Everyone in the room knew it. His excuses fooled no one. Linda Carter cut him off mid-sentence. She said that Velcron assumptions about evolution were clearly flawed. She said humans had proven that progress was not linear or predictable. She said the Velcron had been ahead for millions of years, but that lead had evaporated in just 20,000 years of human development. Then she asked the question that hung in the air like a blade. What should humanity do about the Velcron now? Should Earth treat them the way the Velcron had treated primitive humans? As curiosities, as insects, as beings beneath notice? The silence that followed was absolute. Every Velcron in the delegation felt the weight of that question. They were being judged now, the way they had once judged humanity. The irony was not lost on anyone. Zetharin's mind raced, trying to find the right words, something that would not sound weak, but also would not provoke these terrifying, evolved primates. He was a military commander with 2 centuries of experience, but in this moment he felt like a newly hatched youth facing his first true challenge. Before he could speak, a human male stood up from among the council members. He was young compared to the others, perhaps 40 years old. He introduced himself as Dr. Paul Bennett, a historian. He said the Velcron had 2 choices now. They could return to their empire in ignorance and wonder what humanity had become, or they could stay and learn the truth. He said this decision would shape how the 2 species interacted going forward. He said it with the same calm certainty that all these humans seemed to possess, the certainty of people who knew exactly how powerful they had become. Zetharin looked at his fellow delegates. He saw fear in their eyes, fear and confusion, and the dawning realization that everything they had believed about the galaxy was wrong. Humans were not supposed to be able to do this. 20,000 years was not enough time, but the evidence surrounded them on all sides. This station, these technologies, these confident, evolved beings who looked at Velcron representatives without awe or fear or respect. Just cold assessment. The way a predator looks at potential prey while deciding if it is worth the effort to hunt. The fleet commander made his decision. He said they would stay and learn. He needed to understand what had happened here. How a species dismissed as irrelevant had become something that made his instincts scream warnings. The chairwoman nodded, as if she had expected this answer. She gestured to Dr. Bennett and said he would serve as their guide. Then she dismissed them without ceremony. The meeting was over. The Velcron delegation filed out of the chamber with human guards following at a discreet distance. Not threatening, but always present, always watching. Dr. Paul Bennett led the Velcron delegation through corridors that seemed to shift and change. The walls displayed star charts and historical records that updated in real time. Human workers passed by without giving the aliens more than a curious glance. To them, this was normal. Visitors from other species were nothing special. That casual acceptance was perhaps more disturbing than outright hostility. It meant humans were already thinking beyond their own system, already planning for a galaxy full of other species, already preparing for what came next. They arrived at a massive chamber that Paul called the Archive of Human Achievement. It was not a physical library. Instead, the room was filled with quantum matrices that stored more information than the entire Velcron Imperial database. Holographic displays floated in the air like glowing windows into the past. Paul gestured, and the displays rearranged themselves into a timeline that stretched across the entire chamber. 20,000 years of human history compressed into light and data. Paul turned to face the Velcron with an easy smile. He asked if they wanted to know how humanity had done it, how they had gone from caves to starships in what other species considered an impossibly short time. He said the answer was actually very simple. The Velcron had scared them. Zetharin felt confusion at those words. His people had barely spent a day on Earth. They had not attacked anyone. They had simply observed and left. How could that have created such fear? The historian pulled up images from 20,000 years ago. Small bands of humans gathered around fires, living in caves carved from stone, using tools made from rocks and bones, vulnerable to predators and weather, barely surviving. Then Paul showed them something Zetharan had never considered. The Velcron ship had appeared in Earth's sky for exactly 43 seconds before departing. Just 43 seconds. But dozens of human tribes had seen it. Hundreds of humans had looked up and seen something impossible, something that should not exist in their simple world view. Paul explained that humans had no context for what they saw. So they created one. Gods, demons, spirits, visitors from beyond the world. Every culture that witnessed the Velcron ship created stories about it. Those stories spread. They infected human consciousness like a virus. Suddenly, humans knew on some deep level that they were not alone in the universe. If they were not alone, then they were vulnerable. Other things existed out there. Things that could fly through the sky. Things that might return. The displays fast-forwarded through millennia. Agriculture appeared, not gradually but explosively. Humans went from hunter-gatherers to farmers in a few centuries. Cities rose from nothing. Empires sprawled across continents. Writing systems emerged independently in multiple locations. Mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, engineering. Every advancement seemed to trigger three more. The pace was relentless. While other species took hundreds of thousands of years to progress from one stage to the next, humans compressed it into mere thousands. Paul continued his explanation with the same calm tone. He said that every major human civilization carried myths about beings from the sky. The stories varied in details, but the core remained the same. Something existed beyond Earth, something powerful, something that might return. That knowledge became embedded in human culture. It drove them forward, pushed them to advance, to become stronger, to prepare for the day when the visitors came back. Zetharan watched the timeline continue. The Industrial Revolution. Humans learned to harness steam and coal, machines that could do the work of hundreds, factories that produced goods at impossible rates, then electricity, radio, flight. In just a few hundred years, humans went from sailing ships to aircraft. The rate of change was accelerating, each advancement building on the last, each discovery leading to 10 more. Then came the atomic age. Paul paused the display here. He showed images of mushroom clouds rising over cities. Humans had created weapons that could destroy entire populations. They had done this less than 100 years after learning to fly. The Velcron delegation stared in horror. Most species developed atomic weapons eventually, but they did so after achieving a certain level of wisdom and restraint. Humans had built doomsday weapons while they were still fighting tribal wars over resources and ideology. But Paul explained that even this horror served a purpose. The existence of weapons that could end their species forced humans to think bigger, to look beyond their own planet. If Earth could be destroyed, then humanity needed to spread, to establish colonies elsewhere, to ensure survival even if the home world burned. So they pushed harder into space. Satellites, space stations, moon landings, all of this achieved while humans still struggled with basic problems like hunger and disease. The timeline continued. Computers, internet, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, fusion power. Each breakthrough came faster than the last. Human lifespan doubled, then tripled. Diseases that had killed millions were eliminated. The population grew and spread. Mars was colonized. The asteroid belt was mined. Stations orbited every planet in the system. All of this in just 20,000 years. Paul pulled up schematics of human warships, the same vessels that had surrounded the Velcron fleet. He explained that when humans finally achieved faster-than-light travel, their first priority was not exploration or science. It was defense. They built weapons into every ship, every station, every colony, because humans remembered. They remembered being primitive and vulnerable. They remembered looking up and seeing the Velcron ship. They remembered knowing that something else was out there, something that might not be friendly. The historian gestured to weapons designs that made Velcron military hardware look like children's toys. gravity torpedoes that crushed ships from within, quantum disruptors that erased matter at the subatomic level, nanite swarms that could dissolve entire fleets, railguns that fired projectiles at relativistic speeds, missile systems guided by artificial intelligence that could adapt to any defense, energy weapons that could burn through any known shielding. Every technological breakthrough was weaponized. Every scientific discovery was analyzed for strategic advantage. Paul's expression grew serious. He said that humanity had spent 20,000 years preparing for the day the Velcron returned. Every generation was taught the stories. Every child grew up knowing that something was out there. The drive to advance, to improve, to prepare. It defined human civilization at a fundamental level. They were not like other species who advanced gradually and peacefully. Humans were shaped by fear and determination and the absolute certainty that they would never be caught unprepared again. Zeth Aaron finally found his voice. He asked if their entire civilization had really been shaped by a 43-second encounter. Paul smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He said not just shaped, but defined. Humans were not like the Velcron or any other species the commander had encountered. They did not forget. They did not move on. They did not let go. 20,000 years might seem like a long time, but for humans it was just yesterday. The memory was still fresh. The fear was still real. The determination to never be vulnerable again still burned in every human heart. The historian pulled up current military assessments. The human fleet numbered over 5,000 warships with 10 times that many support vessels. Defense stations dotted the entire solar system, weapon platforms hid in asteroids and on moons. Sensor networks extended light years into deep space. Automated defense systems watched every approach vector. Humans had built Fortress Earth, and they were still building, still preparing, still planning for threats that had not yet appeared. Paul said that humanity had become exactly what they needed to become to face the Velcron as equals, or more accurately as superiors. Because while the Velcron had spent 20,000 years maintaining their empire, humans had spent that same time advancing, pushing, striving, every moment focused on the singular goal of being ready. And now they were ready. More than ready. They were eager to show the galaxy what they had become. The Velcron Empire made a catastrophic mistake. After receiving Fleet Commander Zeth Aaron's initial reports, the High Council refused to believe what they were told. Humans could not have advanced so quickly. The reports must be exaggerated. Zeth Aaron must have been deceived by clever tricks and illusions. The Council decided that a show of force was needed. They would remind these upstart primitives of their place in the galactic order. They assembled a battle fleet of 200 warships and sent them to Earth with orders to demand immediate submission to Imperial authority. Admiral Greg Sullivan was reviewing supply reports in his ready room aboard the EDS Constellation when the alert came through. His first officer, Commander Lisa Morgan, burst through the door without knocking. Her face was flushed with a mixture of excitement and anger. She told him that 200 Velcron warships had just emerged at the edge of the solar system. Their weapons were armed. They were transmitting demands for Earth's surrender. They actually believed they could intimidate humanity into submission. Greg leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a cold smile. After everything humanity had shown the Velcron delegation, they still did not understand. They still thought in terms of their old superiority. They still believed that numbers and threats would be enough. He stood and straightened his uniform. It was time to teach the Velcron what it meant to threaten Earth. Time to show them that humanity's patience had limits. Lisa asked if they should attempt diplomatic communication first. Try to resolve this peacefully. Greg considered the question for exactly 2 seconds before shaking his head. The Velcron had come with weapons armed and demands for surrender. They had made their intentions clear. Diplomacy was no longer an option. The only language they would understand now was force. Overwhelming, undeniable force that would leave no doubt about who controlled this system. He walked onto the bridge and every officer turned to look at him. They all knew what was coming. They had all trained for this moment. Humanity had spent 20,000 years preparing for the day when someone threatened their home. That day had arrived. Greg gave the order and Earth's defense grid came online, the full terrifying scope of it. Every weapon platform hidden in asteroids, every missile battery concealed on moons. Every defense station that had been disguised as civilian structures, all of it activated at once. The Velcron fleet detected the activation and suddenly realized they had made a terrible error. Their sensors showed weapon signatures appearing everywhere. The asteroid belt lit up like a city. Every moon in the solar system suddenly bristled with weapons. Space stations that had appeared peaceful revealed hidden gun ports, and that was just the fixed defenses. The human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. 500 warships materialized around the Velcron armada. They had been waiting just outside sensor range, ready to respond at a moment's notice. But the humans did not attack, not yet. Greg wanted them to understand their situation first. He opened a channel that broadcast simultaneously to every Velcron ship. His face appeared on their displays through what should have been impossible communications technology. He identified himself and spoke calmly as if discussing routine matters. He informed them that they had made two critical errors. First, they had assumed Earth could not detect their fleet massing 3 days ago. Human sensors extended far beyond what the Velcron believed possible. Second, they had assumed that bringing 200 ships would be enough. He gestured off-screen, and data began flooding into Velcron tactical computers. Information that should not have been accessible. Their own systems were compromised. The data showed their true situation. They were not facing 500 human warships. They were targeted by over 15,000 weapon platforms. 300 defense stations, millions of autonomous combat drones that swarmed through the system like schools of mechanical fish. Every single Velcron vessel was painted by a minimum of 73 targeting solutions, weapons locked and ready to fire. Greg continued his explanation in the same calm voice. He said their shields were being scanned by harmonically tuned arrays that had already mapped every structural weakness in their hulls. Their communications were compromised. Human artificial intelligence had infiltrated their computer systems and was waiting for execution commands. In every tactical sense that mattered, they were already dead. He was simply giving them the opportunity to choose life by turning around and leaving human space immediately. The Velcron fleet commander was a decorated warrior named Krelnak. He had fought in dozens of conflicts across the galaxy. He had won victories against superior numbers through cunning and courage. He looked at the data on his screens and made a decision based on his centuries of military experience. He decided the humans were bluffing. No species could have deployed that many weapons platforms. The numbers must be exaggerated, designed to frighten them into retreat. He was not going to be intimidated by primitives who had only recently learned to leave their planet. Krelnak gave the order to open fire. Every ship in his fleet unleashed their weapons at once. Missiles streaked toward human positions. Energy beams lanced through space. Kinetic projectiles accelerated to incredible speeds. It was an overwhelming barrage that should have crippled any fleet. But the human response was instantaneous and devastating. Point defense systems that had been tracking every Velcron weapon since the moment they powered up opened fire. Lasers intersected missiles in mid-flight. Explosive projectiles were vaporized. Energy beams were absorbed by shields that barely flickered from the impacts. Then the humans returned fire, and Krelnak realized his fatal mistake. Gravity torpedoes phased through Velcron shields and detonated inside ship hulls. The weapons created localized gravity wells that crushed internal structures like tin cans under immense pressure. Crews were pulped instantly. Ships imploded from within. Quantum disruptors fired invisible beams that simply erased sections of Velcron vessels. Matter ceased to exist where the beams touched. Ships came apart as critical structures vanished into nothingness. Nanite swarms launched from human vessels and spread across space like metallic clouds. When they contacted Velcron hulls, they began dissolving the armor, billions of microscopic machines working in concert to break down molecular bonds. Ships started coming apart as their outer layers turned to dust. Railguns fired solid projectiles at speeds approaching light. When they hit Velcron vessels, the kinetic energy release was equivalent to tactical nuclear weapons. Ships shattered into fragments. Crews died before they even knew they were under attack. The battle lasted exactly 4 minutes. In that time, 173 Velcron ships were disabled or completely destroyed. The survivors were in shock. Their shields had proven useless. Their armor had been stripped away like paper. Their weapons had been defeated before they could do any damage. The human fleet had barely taken a scratch. A few shields had flickered. A couple of minor impacts on reinforced hulls. Nothing that even qualified as damage. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Greg's face appeared on the screens of the 27 surviving ships. He asked if they wished to continue. His tone suggested he would be perfectly happy either way. The surviving Velcron commanders looked at their devastated fleet and made the only rational choice available. They surrendered. All weapons were powered down. All ships stopped moving. They waited for human forces to board them and take them prisoner. It was the most complete and humiliating defeat in Velcron military history. Krelnak sat in his command chair and stared at the wreckage floating around his ship. Pieces of vessels that had been whole just minutes before. Escape pods broadcasting distress signals. Emergency beacons marking debris fields where proud warships had been. He had commanded this fleet with absolute confidence. 200 ships crewed by the finest warriors the Velcron Empire could provide. They had come here to intimidate primitives. Instead, they had been swatted aside like insects. The irony would have been amusing if it were not so terrifying. Human boarding parties arrived within the hour. They moved through Velcron ships with practiced efficiency. Every crew member was scanned and cataloged. Weapons were confiscated. Computer systems were locked down. The Velcron warriors did not resist. They had seen what human weapons could do. Fighting would be suicide. So they allowed themselves to be taken prisoner by beings their empire had dismissed as evolutionary deadweight 20,000 years ago. Back on Unity Station, Director Kate Morrison watched the battle reports with satisfaction. The Velcron had needed to learn this lesson. Words alone would not have convinced them. But 4 minutes of overwhelming military superiority had done what hours of diplomatic discussion could not. Now they understood. Now they would take the message back to their empire. Humanity was not prey. Humanity was not weak. Humanity was the most dangerous thing in their section of the galaxy, and anyone who forgot that would share the fate of Krelnak's fleet. The Velcron High Council received Fleet Commander Zeth Aren's final report 3 weeks after the battle. They read it in stunned silence. Read it again, sent queries demanding confirmation. Every word was verified, every detail checked against sensor logs and witness accounts. The impossible truth could not be denied. Humanity had defeated a Velcron battle fleet in 4 minutes with minimal losses. 20,000 years had transformed cave-dwelling primitives into the most formidable military power the Velcron had ever encountered. The council chambers erupted in chaos. Some members demanded immediate mobilization of the full Imperial fleet. They wanted to crush humanity before it could spread beyond its home system. Others argued for peace and diplomatic recognition. A few suggested complete withdrawal from that region of space. The debates raged for weeks. Old certainties crumbled. Everything the Velcron believed about galactic order had been proven wrong. If humans could advance so quickly, what else might be possible? What other assumptions were dangerously outdated? On Earth, humanity faced its own reckoning. Director Kate Morrison sat in her office overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The view was spectacular, blue water stretching to the horizon, clouds drifting across a perfect sky. She had requested this office specifically because the view reminded her of what they were fighting to protect. Everything humanity had built could be threatened by hostile species. The Velcron had proven that. Their arrogance, their assumption of superiority, their willingness to use military force when challenged. The holographic displays around her desk showed feeds from across human space. Governor Ryan Parker connected from Mars Colony. His weathered face filled one screen. Administrator Claire Hughes appeared from the Jovian stations. Commander Jake Sullivan joined from the Outer System settlements. All the major colonial leaders were present for this meeting. They needed to discuss what came next, because the Velcron were just the beginning. Kate spoke without preamble. She said they had won. The Velcron were retreating from human space. Their empire was in chaos. Multiple species they had subjugated were considering rebellion inspired by humanity's victory. On the surface, everything looked positive, but her expression showed no satisfaction, only concern. Ryan asked the obvious question. If they won, why did she look like someone preparing for a funeral? She pulled up a star chart of the local galactic arm. Hundreds of systems glowed in different colors, representing different power blocks. She highlighted the Velcron Empire. It was large, covering nearly 300 star systems, a major regional power. Then she highlighted other empires, much larger ones. The Hive Collective, 3,000 light-years away, controlled 700 systems through biological assimilation. They absorbed other species and turned them into extensions of a single vast consciousness. Individual identity ceased to exist. The synthetic alliance sprawled across 1,000 systems. It was a merger of organic species and artificial intelligence. They had computational resources that dwarfed humanity's entire economy. They could simulate billions of scenarios and plan centuries ahead. Then there was the Concordat of ancient races. They had been spacefaring for over 1,000,000 years. They possessed technologies that seemed like magic. They could manipulate space-time, create pocket universes, generate energy from vacuum. They made the Velcron look primitive. Kate said that Earth had just announced itself to the entire galaxy. Every major power would receive reports about humanity's victory. They would send scouts, researchers, diplomats. Some would come with peaceful intentions. Others would see humanity as a potential threat that needed to be evaluated or eliminated. The Velcron had been one regional power. These other empires were galactic superpowers. Humanity had proven it could defend one star system. But could they face enemies that controlled hundreds or thousands? Claire asked quietly if Kate believed humanity could not defeat these greater powers. The director shook her head. She said it was not about whether they could win. It was about how long they had to prepare. The Velcron had dismissed humanity because they assumed progress was slow and predictable. These older empires would not make that mistake. They would come expecting a military power. They would bring sufficient force to ensure victory. Humanity needed to advance again, needed to become stronger, needed to spread across the galaxy before the real threats arrived. She pulled up projections and timelines, analysis done by the best strategic minds humanity possessed. They estimated maybe 1 century before major powers turned their full attention to human space. 100 years to go from defending a single system to claiming hundreds. From a regional power to a galactic empire. It seemed impossible. But then again, 20,000 years ago, traveling to the moon had seemed impossible. Humans had proven very good at achieving the impossible when survival was at stake. Jake spoke carefully. He said Kate was talking about expansion, about claiming worlds that might already be inhabited, about becoming the thing they had just fought against, the empire that bullied weaker species. Kate looked at him steadily. She said no. They would not become the Velcron, but they would become powerful enough that no one could threaten Earth. The galaxy was not empty. It was not friendly. Species competed for resources and territory. The only way to ensure humanity's survival was to make themselves too dangerous to attack. She stood and walked to the window. The ocean below was peaceful, beautiful, completely unaware of the cosmic forces that could threaten it. She said 20,000 years ago humans were primitives huddling in caves, afraid of predators and the dark. Today, they were the predators. Tomorrow they needed to become the apex predator of the entire galaxy. Not because they wanted conquest, but because every other option led to potential extinction. The universe did not care about fairness or justice. It cared about strength. Ryan asked what she was proposing. Kate turned back to face the holographic displays. She outlined a plan that had been developed over months by strategic planners. Immediate expansion into neighboring systems. Colony ships already under construction. Terraforming technology ready to deploy. Within a decade, humanity would control 50 systems. Within 50 years, 500. Within a century, they would have the territory and resources to face any threat. But it required total commitment. Every resource, every citizen, everything focused on expansion and preparation. The vote was unanimous. Humanity would expand. They would claim new worlds. They would build an empire that would make them secure. Not for glory or wealth, but for survival. Because they knew now what the galaxy was really like. Full of species that would judge them, threaten them, try to control or destroy them. Humans had learned 20,000 years ago that they were not alone. Now they understood what that really meant. Safety came from strength. Peace came from being too dangerous to attack. Far away on a Velcron space station, Zetharin prepared his final report. He had been recalled from Earth. His mission was over. But before he left, he needed to send one last message. A warning that would be transmitted to every known spacefaring civilization. He sat before recording equipment and gathered his thoughts. What he was about to say would change galactic politics for centuries to come. He began speaking slowly and clearly. He identified himself and his credentials. Then he delivered his assessment of humanity. He said they were not like other species. They did not forgive perceived slights. They did not forget threats. They did not stop advancing. In 20,000 years, they had progressed from stone tools to weapons that terrified a species with millions of years of history. They were driven by paranoia so deep it defined their entire civilization. They saw every other species as a potential enemy. They would not rest until they were the dominant power in the galaxy. Zetharin said that humanity was not a normal civilization. They were a predator species that had been awakened. The Velcron visit 20,000 years ago had infected them with knowledge of the greater galaxy. That knowledge had driven them to prepare, to advance, to become something that could fight back. And now, they were ready. More than ready. They were eager to expand, to claim new territory, to ensure their survival through strength. He ended his report with a plea. Do not wake them further. Do not challenge them. Do not assume that because they seem peaceful now, they will remain that way. Humanity remembered being judged inferior. They remembered being dismissed as irrelevant. They would never allow that to happen again. Every species that encountered them needed to understand this. Humans were dangerous not because they were aggressive, but because they refused to ever be vulnerable again. The transmission was sent through every diplomatic channel the Velcron possessed. Within a month, it reached every major power in that section of the galaxy. Reactions varied. Some species laughed at the warning. How dangerous could one species really be? Others began preparing, increasing military budgets, reinforcing border systems. A few simply watched and waited. They would see what humanity did next before deciding how to respond. In the Sol system, Humanity looked toward the stars with ancient ambition burning in their hearts. Colony ships were launched. Terraforming equipment was deployed. Survey teams mapped new systems. Military outposts were established at strategic locations. Every day, the human sphere of influence grew larger. Every week, new technologies emerged from research facilities. Faster ships, better weapons, stronger shields, more efficient resource extraction. Director Kate Morrison watched it all from her office and allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. They had begun. The age of human expansion, the age when Earth would become not just a world, but the center of an empire. It had started with a 43-second encounter 20,000 years ago. A Velcron ship appearing in the sky and vanishing. That brief moment had changed everything, had driven humanity to become what they needed to be. First to survive, then to thrive, now to dominate. She pulled up the strategic maps showing projected expansion over the next century. So many worlds, so many resources, so much potential, but also so many possible threats. The galaxy was vast and filled with ancient powers. Humanity was still young, still learning, but they had proven they could adapt, could advance, could fight when necessary. The next century would determine if that was enough, if humanity could claim its place among the stars, or if they would be crushed by forces older and stronger than themselves. Kate made a silent promise to the planet below, to the billions of humans who looked to her leadership. They would not fail, would not stop, would not rest until humanity was secure. Whatever it took, however long the journey, Earth and all its children would survive and prosper. The galaxy would learn what it meant to underestimate humanity. The Velcron had learned that lesson at terrible cost. Others would follow, and eventually everyone would understand. Humans were not prey, they were predators, and they were hungry for the stars.